Okay, so this is our third lecture. It's a recap of what we have done again. And this lecture concerns about project life cycle and organization. So we talked about how project move from initiation all the way up to their closing or the rollout. And we also talked about the different types of organizational structures that are available for project managers to organize their projects. So that's the agenda item for this lecture. So, as we talked about this before, life cycles are basically different ideas that help us to understand how something moves from the beginning all the way towards its conclusion, right? So, in the same way, projects can be divided into different types of phases, and these are the phases that projects will go through in order to go from their starting all the way down to their conclusion, right? So life cycles are something that we talked about before. We know that these are familiar concepts. For example, there's the water life cycle and there's the human life cycle as well, right? So the idea is quite similar to that. So what we did was that we concentrated upon dividing a project into small phases, and the sample life cycle that we considered was something called the project software development life cycle, or specifically life cycles for projects that have to do something with the development of software, right? So why do we do this decomposition, and why do we want to understand the pieces of the project is because by themselves projects are quite complex. They're tremendously large entities. So by breaking them down into small pieces, we can understand each of the pieces. We could organize ourselves better for each phase, and then we can put the appropriate resources for each phase so that we can manage it better and we can achieve the outcome that we want to do, right? So we're breaking down a project into its life cycle because we want to manage these projects better, right? And then, secondly, these life cycles allow us to consider the activities of the project in light of the activities that happen within the operational activities, because mostly we're going to be borrowing resources from these operational activities and placing them onto the project. So having a life cycle allows us to have better alignment there, right? So the software development life cycle is composed of six different phases, and these phases were the idea phase, the prototype phase, the design phase, the coding phase, the testing phase, and the rollout phase. The idea phase is concerned about coming up with ideas of what kind of projects to do. So this is easy to do if you're an individual thinking about what options you have available, but it's slightly difficult to do if you are a group of people trying to figure out what to do. So how do you come up with ideas? Well, you could do brainstorming, you can do the Delphi technique, you can do some expert judgments and whatever have you. So there's definitely different types of management techniques available that help for idea generation in a group setting or in a group environment. So once the idea has been set up or a bunch of ideas have come out, we have to then go through this process. Before we can select an idea and decide that this is the one that we want to pursue, we have to first evaluate those ideas. So how do you do this evaluation? Well, there's this economic evaluation that has to be done. So we have to look at the idea from the perspective of finance and accounting and economics, and figure out whether it's going to be a lucrative endeavor, something that we want to pursue because it will allow us to make money, right? But not everything that we do in life is about money. There's many projects that happen which are concerned about social welfare and improving the lives of people. So in those cases, then mostly it's not a money-making enterprise that we are after. Rather, we are after this quest of creating goodness in society somehow, right? So either we have to do an economic analysis or we have to do sort of a social analysis of that. So once that is done, an idea is selected, and only when an idea is selected in the software phase, what happens is that the prototyping concept begins. So a prototyping is basically to sort of put that idea very quickly into some sort of form or shape that allows us to envision what that idea would look like if it were to be followed through and completed, right? So a prototype is sort of like a model of what you would have in the end, but these prototypes are not something that we can use and deploy. Rather, we're using them for a very specific purpose, which is to figure out completely what requirements that we have for the projects that we want to do, right? So the prototyping phase for us in the software development lifecycle is pretty much concerned about the idea of generating requirements. So the arrow that leads from the prototype to the design is where we're going to get the output of the prototyping phase. And what is the output of the prototyping phase? It is actually a rough working model along with a requirements document that clearly states what requirements all the stakeholders have regarding this particular software project. And in the same way, the idea phase is also going to have certain outputs, which is a collection of ideas that have been evaluated either in economic terms, business terms, or in social terms, uh, and a decision has been made as to which idea needs to be pursued. So once the requirements have been figured out, then the next step is to move into the design phase. What happens here is that the requirements are then engineered and a working design is formulated, which would found the basis of the coding or the execution of it, right? So the design phase leads us into coding, but an output is created at the end of the design, and that would be the software design document, which is going to be an engineered type of a concept, right? The design is going to be completely engineered. Then we move into the coding phase. So this is basically another way of saying that somebody is going to sit down and program the design so that it becomes executable and we can run it on our computers, right? So the coding or the execution is what happens here, as where we put the design into action. So the coding phase gives an outcome as well or an output as well, and that output is going to be a working software. Right? So once we have the software, then we can move into testing to see whether it works properly and does it meet all the requirements that we had or not. Right? And after the testing, we get a particular output, which is that either the software would pass the test or it would fail. So if it passes the test, that means that it is acceptable, and then we can do the rollout, which means that we can deploy the software. Right? So that's just one example of a life cycle. If we want to customize this life cycle and think about construction concept, so then sure, we'll have ideas and then we'll have some requirements and then we'll have a blueprint drawing and then we'll have the construction of it and then we'll make sure that the quality is correct and it's acceptable and all the requirements have been made, and finally we'll give the key to the customer and say, well, here's your constructed site. Right, so you could have a life cycle. So depending upon what nature of the project is and what type of a project is being conducted, these life cycles are going to be slightly different. So each industry or each sector would have their own life cycles for their projects. But the thought that we want to take away from these is that these arrowheads are quite important. The arrows that are connecting the idea to the prototype, to the design, to the coding, and so forth. Now, what happens is that outputs are being generated at each of these arrowheads. Once we get the output, if you recall, I mentioned that we have to do something with these outputs, which is that we have to check them for completeness, we have to check them for accuracy, and we have to provide assigned approval. So there's three things happening. check for completeness, check for accuracy, and provide your signed approval. As a project manager, if you don't receive a signed approval, for example, for the prototype, then you are going to refuse to orchestrate the design phase. Unless you get the signed approval for the design, you are not going to go into the coding. And unless you get a signed approval of the code, you're not going to go into testing, right? So it's very important that these three criteria are met and signed approvals are received from the people. So that would introduce a little bit of a delay into the project because certain processes have to be conducted or run, and these processes would allow us then to basically check for these three things before we can move forward, right? So we have to include or introduce this additional time period that would be spent to do this into our project timeline. Uh, Also, within the phases, like within the prototype or within the design and within the coding, we will have other small goals placed within the project. So we may say, well, the first iteration of the prototype, or a particular meeting, or some sort of a document would be created, right? So we put them inside the phase as a particular mini goal for ourselves, and we call these as milestones, right? So as we move along, different types of milestones of the project are going to be achieved, right? And why do we want to have many milestones as opposed to one singular big milestone towards the end? Because we want to get a sense of progression towards the goal, and we want to see whether we are actually moving forward towards the goal and what is the rate of our progression. Meaning, are we doing it slowly? And are we going to be able to meet the timeline? Are we doing it too fast and we're going to exceed our timeline and do it, before the deadline? Or are we going well in the sense that we're going to be completing the project right on time, right? So the major outcome of each of the phases is a major milestone, and within each of the phases of this life cycle, we're going to have smaller milestones. And if you remember, I mentioned to you that the milestones are represented in the form of small little blacked out diamonds inside the plans that we're making, right? So this links us from the beginning of the project to the all the way towards the end. Now, the caveat here is that sometimes feasibility studies are conducted, and these feasibility studies may result in the idea being unfeasible and being rejected altogether. So, what if you have a bunch of ideas that came up? You checked their feasibility and you rejected them all. So, are you then going to have the prototype and design and coding and so forth? So, definitely not. That would terminate the project, right? So, the thought here is that the idea phase should be considered to be a completely separate set of activities, and the feasibility analysis of the project should be treated as a project in itself. And the second project then begins, the major project then begins, particularly with the prototype and the design, and from that point forward, right? So feasibility studies should be treated as separate projects, and what happens after the prototype all the way up to the rollout should be treated as a project in itself. Now, feasibility studies, why do we treat them as separate projects? Well, very simple to state that these may end up with a no-go decision. That means that the feasibility may come up with results suggesting that the project is not feasible. Or it may be the case that a project may come out to be accepted and it is considered to be feasible, but there may be some sort of political pressure, social pressure that prevents us from executing that project. An example of a feasibility study that was accepted to be good, and the project was considered to be a feasible project, but it did not go into the execution phase would be this Kalabag Dam idea that we have locally, right? So the feasibility test clearly has suggested as a feasible project, but it has never been executed because there's political and social pressures out there. Now, the transition happens between the phases where we move from one phase to the other phase, right? And the outputs that are being produced at the end of each phase, we call those as the deliverables. And you have to remember that three things have to happen. You have to check for completeness, you have to check for accuracy, and you must get signed approval. Right? Then later on, we learned that we can do some fast tracking, which is that we can compress the schedules of the project somehow. So I won't mention fast tracking in more detail here for now. Rather, I would talk about it in a complete separate lecture in itself. But fast tracking is something that could be done to sort of expedite the workflows of the project. There's another technique as well called crashing. We'll do some exercises on crashing after we have learned the per CPM. So let's leave them for now. Just let's keep the thought in mind that there's a life cycle present and there's transitions taking place from one phase to the other, and at each transitory point, we're getting a particular output called a deliverable, and that deliverable has to be checked for completeness, accuracy, and it has to be signed for approval. And you have minor milestones across the phases. The deliverable that you're getting at the end is a major milestone. So this allows us to think about what happens in a project all the way from the start to the end. Now, as projects stand, there's a couple of problems or a couple of issues that arise, which is that if you look at this graph that you have in front of you, on the y-axis we've got the value, right? So projects are less valuable at the beginning, and x-axis is the time period, meaning moving from the beginning of the project all the way towards the end of the project. So at the very beginning of the project, and I'm looking at the first line, which is moving from the bottom x-axis all the way upward in this way towards the closeout, right? So that's the line I'm concentrating upon right now. So in the beginning of the project is not very valuable. But as you move into requirements, and as you move into design, and as you move into execution, and as you go closer and closer to the closeout or the rollout of the project becomes more and more and more valuable, right? So this is something that we have to be keeping in mind, that projects are less valuable at the beginning, more valuable towards the end. Then the other two lines, which are moving downwards, right? These are telling us about two things. One is the influence of the stakeholders, and the other is the risk of the project. So projects are more risky at the beginning because we're still in this time of discovery and learning and setting up and organizing our things. So the chances of the idea going haywire and not executing it well are quite high. But as we move closer and closer and closer towards the closing of the project, that risk or that uncertainty reduces and diminishes quite significantly, right? So when are the projects the most risky? Well, they're the most risky at the beginning. When are they the least risky? Well, that's towards the closing. When are the projects the least valuable? At the start. When are they most valuable? They are the most valuable at the beginning. At the end. And the influence of the stakeholders has to be high at the beginning, and the influence has to be low towards the end. Because if you don't involve the stakeholders at the start of the project, and then suddenly they get involved towards the end of the project, what would happen is that they'll start meddling with your affairs, and they'll start putting their thoughts in front of you a bit late. So what would that do is that it would actually increase the risk of the project. So we have to make sure that we involve the stakeholders highly at the end, and they are highly influential. And as we move towards the closing of the project, the influence is going to be slowly and gradually diminishing and reducing. So, what do these phases of the life cycle do for us, and what is this life cycle defining for us? Well, they are sort of helping us to understand what technical work is going to be done in each of the phases. So, if we say idea, so who's going to generate the idea? How are they going to generate the idea? And how is an idea going to be evaluated? And how is it going to be selected? So, that's a completely package type of specialized area, and certain people are going to be involved. Now, if we talk about the prototyping and the requirement elicitation, well, that's another technical area which requires that we identify the stakeholders and we go and talk to these stakeholders and we identify the user and the principal and the sponsor. And we capture all these people's requirements, right? And then we write these requirements in a particular language or in a particular way, which makes them very clear that there's no ambiguousness to these requirements, right? Inherently, the English language or Urdu or Pashto is quite an ambiguous language. So as these projects become more and more technical, then there are specific languages and specific methods that are available in which these requirements are written down. You may have heard of something called the Unified Modeling Language. If you have not heard of it, that's not a problem because you're not computer science students, but in the common computer science domain, sometimes they use use cases and the UML language to write down the requirements. Then for more technical type of projects where human life is dependent upon them, such as aircraft systems and airport management systems, for those the requirements are written down in a highly mathematical language called the Z language, right? And if we're talking about normal type of projects like construction and so forth, so in that we use the English language, but we use the more formal English language and we use words that are clear and not confusing, right? So technical things are happening in that area. And then if we talk about the design, well, that's a completely different technical area because then other type of expertise would be needed, right? So each of the things explains to us what kind of technical work is going to happen. Also, the phase is helping us to figure out the deliverables that will be generated. So we're not specifically concerned about the major deliverable that happens. We're also concerned about these minor milestones that we have in place because certain deliverables will be generated in those as well. So we have to figure out what deliverables are those that we are concerned about, one. And number two, we are also going to be concerned about when these deliverables are going to be produced and who's going to be responsible for producing them and who's going to be responsible for approving them and who's going to be responsible for receiving them and so on and so forth, right? So having a life cycle allows us to start thinking more in those management lines as well as the technical lines also, right? So it helps us to improve our management. Then also we're concerned about the human resources and placing them in the right area of the project at the right time. So do we want to have those people that are useful in the requirements writing to be present across the project, all these phases, all the way from the beginning of the project to the end? So that would be inappropriate because then you'll have these bunch of people who did some work for you at a particular instance in time, but then before that instance in time and after that instance in time, these people are sitting around idle and yet you have to pay them. So this is not how project work is going to be taking place because we don't want to be paying people money for work that they are not doing for us, right? So having this idea of the life cycle allows us to determine when to hire, when to fire, when to bring people onto the project, when to release the people off from the project, right? And also we start thinking about control and approval, right? So monitoring would happen, evaluation would happen, and if things are not going the way that you had planned as a result from your monitoring and evaluation of the data, then you can start exercising control mechanisms. But if things are going according to the plans that you had, then there's no need to exercise control. And then the idea of approval, right? Checking for completeness, accuracy, and approval. Who is going to be responsible for doing this, right? So the life cycle allows you to start thinking in those lines. Right? Now, we talked yesterday in the second lecture, recap lecture, about this idea of the project management office, and I suggested to you that the PMO is one of the major stakeholders. Right? So there's other stakeholders in a project as well. There's the project manager. There's the team members and their families. How are the families the stakeholders? Well, the team members may, if you have them engaged for too long, their work-life balance suffers. If you have them in some sort of a hardship environment, then these people fall ill, so their families are going to suffer, right? Health and safety issues and so forth. So these team members are stakeholders, and their families are stakeholders. Then there's the project management team. These are the people that actually execute the project for you. So these people are the stakeholders. The customer, the person buying the project or funding the project, is basically a stakeholder. And the final user, the person who's going to use the outcome of the project, is also a stakeholder, right? The organizations performing the work for you, the managers, the owners, etc., are the stakeholders. The sponsor or the champion, the person who gave their blessing to the project and approved this project, they are a stakeholder. Then there's lobbying organizations, right? That are lobbying for either a project to happen, and they're hopeful that it becomes successful. So these are positive influencers. Then you've got competitors who want your projects to be unsuccessful, so they are negative influencers. So these people are also stakeholders in society and government and funders and suppliers and contractors and subcontractors, etc. These are all different types of people that we consider to be stakeholders. So when we start thinking about requirements and capturing the requirements from the different stakeholders, so these are the people that we have to ensure that their requirements are captured. Now we can think more deeply about these stakeholders, and we can figure out who are the more influential stakeholders as opposed to the least or less influential stakeholders. So of course, there are some people that are more important. For example, the person paying the money is more important. The person using the product is more important. The person doing the work, and those people are more important, right? Other people, such as your competitors, are important, but what can you do about them, right? You just have to make sure that you exercise a window of opportunity and complete the project on time and hopefully defeat your competition. Or are you going to sit with your competitors and ask them what their requirements are? So definitely not. So some of these stakeholders are the ones that we are going to capture the requirements, and others are of the nature that we're not going to talk to them. Right? Interestingly enough, there's another category of stakeholders as well, which are called as the silent stakeholders. Right? So an example of a silent stakeholder would be the environment, because the environment cannot speak for itself. So somebody has to take on the responsibility of speaking on behalf of that stakeholder. So the environment is considered to be a silent stakeholder. Right? So these stakeholders are directly or indirectly involved in your project, and they influence your project either in a positive manner or in a negative manner. And we use these stakeholders to capture their requirements. Then we moved into this other idea, which was to think about the different types of organizational structures that would be possible, right? So kindly ignore this concept here that says appears on the exam. These are slides that I made for a training many years ago. So I'm just using them as handy material for right now. They haven't been customized specifically for what we talked about, or specifically for your class, or they were made for a training. So, but the material is pretty much what we talked about. Right? So there's 5 different organizational structures. And this is very, very, very confusing specifically because actually there's not 5 types of organizational structures. There's 3 major types of organizational structures. The first type is a functional organization. The second type is a matrix organization. And the third type is a projectized organization. So in essence, there are 3 types of organizational structures: the functional, the matrix, and the projectized. So that's where we are. Now, in the functional uh, organizational structure, um, this is the very initial organizational structure that came about early in the 1960s when the discipline of project management started. And basically, what was going on was that somebody from within the organization was made the project manager, and they had to do both the activities of the project and of their operational activity. And the people working on the project similarly were doing both their operational activities and also their project activities. So in that case, what happens is that this thing happens, right? The project manager, because they were part-time, they had little or no authority level. They had little or no resource availability. Who controlled the budget? It was the functional or the operational manager, right? I'm looking at the functional hierarchy and its column here, right? The project manager was part-time, and the administrative staff or the project management team members that were there were also part-time. So this is how things worked in the beginning. Then slowly and gradually, this idea came that, well, these type of organizational structures are perhaps not working well. So the movement started that, slowly and gradually towards the matrix form of organization. So the weak matrix idea came up, but we're going to ignore it altogether and say that the weak matrix is pretty much like the functional setup because it was an attempt to move from the functional hierarchy into the matrix hierarchy, right? So for our purposes, for the BBA and MPA level, we'll simply consider the weak matrix and the functional matrix to be exactly the same things, right? And you'll see little difference between the two if you look at the 2 columns there, right? So let's now move to the matrix structure. The matrix structure, we are looking at the balanced matrix, which is in the middle, right? That's essentially the matrix structure. So what happens in this matrix structure is that the project manager's authority now is moving from limited and little or none towards low or moderate. Resource availability is now low or moderate. The control of the budget has become mixed. So the project manager and the function manager are both sort of controlling it. Well, the functional manager sort of vanishes because now, in this case, as I had mentioned to you in the class, we plucked out the person who was in the organizational hierarchy, and that person was assigned the role of a project manager, and they were alleviated in status so that now they are at par with some sort of a functional head. So the authority level of the budget becomes mixed in the sense that the sponsor is still the main person controlling that budget, but the project manager has now more control over it. And the project manager is now full time, whereas the project management staff and administrative staff is still part time, right? So the second type of a organizational structure of concern is the matrix, and if I say matrix, I'm normally considering the balanced matrix unless I speak about the strong or the weak matrix. Now, the strong matrix column is again the same way like the weak matrix, right? Where the weak matrix is this idea when we are moving these founders or project managers who are trying to attempt to create this matrix hierarchy. So that weak matrix thought originated there. The strong matrix thought originated when the problems with the balanced matrix came up, and the founders or project managers were trying to come up with yet a new type of a hierarchy named as the projectized hierarchy. So the strong matrix, in essence, is pretty much the same as the projectized hierarchy for the purpose of our class, and it is an attempt, right, on the way towards the matrix, right? So towards the projectized. So the third hierarchy that we have to consider is the projectized hierarchy, where the project manager has now ultimate authority, ultimate availability of resources, full control of the budget, full time employment as a project manager, and the administrative staff is also full time, right? So again, there's not five types of organizational structures, rather there's three key types: the functional, the matrix, and the projectized. The weak matrix is the same as the functional, the strong matrix is the same as the projectized. So the balanced matrix is the only matrix type of a hierarchy that we have, right? So the functional manager is going to be the departmental head who's responsible for running their day-to-day activities, and the project manager is responsible for the project and making sure that the project executes. Right? And you just have to concentrate here and understand that the project manager's role evolves, right? First, the project manager is part-time. In the weak matrix, they are part-time. In the matrix and in the strong matrix, they are full-time. And in the projectized, they are also full-time. So where do we put this idea of a project expediter and coordinator? So that would be right here. In the functional and in the weak matrix, the project manager, because they are part-time, they've got limited authority, therefore they're not really managers, rather they are considered to be project expediters and coordinators. Right, so let's not confuse this any further. Which one is the ideal hierarchy? Well, the ideal hierarchy would be considered as the projectile. Which one is the most frequently used hierarchy nowadays in projects? Well, that's the matrix or the balanced matrix hierarchy. More than 90% of the projects worldwide follow the matrix hierarchy. You know, each of them has their own problems and issues associated with them, and the advantages and disadvantages are there. So, for example, the disadvantage of functional hierarchy is that people place more emphasis on their functional specialty. They are more concerned about what they have to do within their operational activities. So that's one disadvantage. They are more invested in the operational activity, less invested in the work that they have to do for the project. And secondly, there is no career progression for the project manager. So these are two disadvantages. The advantage is that management is easier because you've got specialists with you, and people report only to one supervisor, and that supervisor is basically their functional head. Now, the matrix has more advantages and even more disadvantages, right? But clearly, you've got more control over resources. You're full time as a project manager. You've got, more authority and so forth. So that, in a way, is better. And people maintain a home in the sense that they work on the project, and when they finish, they can go back to their operational activity. And what is the major disadvantage? Well, the major disadvantage is something called a two-home problem, a two-boss problem, where the workers now have two bosses to deal with. One is their project manager and the other is their operation manager, right? So the second disadvantage, which is that you have more than one bosses, is one of the major disadvantages. There's others, but those are not of concern for us in our class because, as I mentioned, these are slides for training. So they are more detailed in that sense because that was a advanced level course. So for right now, we'll just consider these two advantages and disadvantages. And then in the projectiles, what happens is that you've got more efficiency because every person is allocated to a separate project. Each person is loyal to their own project. There's more effective communication taking place because people don't have many other things to do. They're concentrated upon the project activities. But there's this issue called a no home problem, which means that the people working on the project will not have a home once the project comes to a conclusion. They will be without a job, right? So in that case, they will have a less commitment towards the project, so to speak, and towards the end of the project, everybody is going to be looking towards other projects in order to keep themselves gainfully employed. So we'll keep very few advantages and disadvantages for you and I. Now, what is the role of the PMO and what is in the organizational structure, right? So the PMO basically drives the organizational structure. The PMO is going to tell you whether to do the project in a functional setup, whether to do the project in a balanced matrix setup, or to do it in a projectized setup, right? So the PMO drives it, and then the PMO helps you to put people into that organizational structure. It helps you in negotiating the different type of people that you want to have a part of your project. Right? So PMO is quite integral in that sense. Now, there's this other idea which was sort of developed by Deming and then later on modified by Schuhart, which is this idea of PDCA, the plan, do, check, and act, right? You plan something, you do it, you check to see how you did it, and then if you haven't done it right, you act accordingly. And so, how does that idea fit into this idea of the project management life cycle or the phases of the life cycle? So that's very simple. In each of the phase of the life cycle, the phases were the idea, the prototype, the design, and so forth. So within each of these phases, we have the cycle of PDCA, right? So if we think about design, we have to plan the design, we have to do the design, we have to check the design, and we have to act accordingly. And in the same way, if we think about coding or execution, we have to plan it, do it, check it, and then act accordingly. And so within each of the phases of the life cycle, you've got the PDCA processes sort of run. Right? So this is how it goes. It's a cyclical thing. Plan, do, check, act, replan, do, check, act, replan, do, check, act. This is how it goes. And these align with each of the phases of the life cycle. So within each of the life cycle phases, these are happening. Now, within the life cycle phases, there's something else happening as well, right? So let's clarify this. We've got the design as a phase. Now, within the design, we've got certain processes happening. We've got the initiating, we've got the planning, we've got the execution, we've got the closing. Within the initiating, we've got the PDCA. Within the planning, we've got the PDCA. Within the execution, we've got the plan, do, check, act. And within the closing, we've got the plan, do, check, act. Then we move to the next phase. So execution. So in the execution, we initiate the execution, we plan the execution, we execute the execution, and we monitor and control the execution, and we close the execution. And within all of these, with the initiating, the planning, the execution, the monitoring and control, and the closing, we have to have the PDCA, right? So it's nothing complex. Rather, we're saying that we broke down the project into big pieces in the form of the life cycle, and we looked at each of the phases of the life cycle and said, well, what is going to happen here? So we have to start it, we have to plan it, we have to do it, we have to check how we did it, and then we have to bring it to a conclusion. And what happens within that is that we're doing this little or small level of planning and execution and checking and so forth for all the little activities that are being performed within there, right? So this is how it goes. Now, there is a difference between the process groups and the phases of the life cycle. So just be clear that the phases are the initiating phase, the idea phase, the prototyping phase, the design phase, the execution phase, and so forth. And what are the process groups? Well, the process groups are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and control, and closing. Right. So there's 5 processes that come together to form a group of processes, and there could be many different phases. So within each phase, we've got processes. Right? And then the idea of progressive elaboration again pops up, and what the term that we like to use here is something called the rolling wave planning. Rolling wave means that we've got abstract plans, and then slowly and gradually a more detailed plan. And what happens that these arrows that are there in each of the phases of the life cycle, what do we call them? Well, we call them as stage gates, phase exits, or kill points, or exit points, or kill gates, etc. Right? So there are several terms used for them. The idea is that after every phase of the life cycle, we revisit the purpose of why this project got started, and if that purpose has ceased to exist, then we can abandon the project and we don't continue forward. Right? Um, so we don't confuse the phases with the process groups. We keep them as separate concepts, right? And fast tracking and crashing are two ways to sort of compress the timetable of a project. Somehow, fast tracking is not something that is optional, rather it is mandatory. So wherever you can do fast tracking, you would do it. And crashing is something optional. You may decide to crash or you may not. So once we learn about crashing, we'll understand why it is optional. And once we talk about fast tracking in more detail, we'll understand why that is compulsory and it has to be done. Right? Now, we've yesterday talked about the reasons of the project, right? So at each of the kill points or exit points that are happening between the phases, we go back to these and see, well, is the market demand still there? So if the market demand is still present, we move to the next phase. Otherwise, we abandon the project. Is the organization need still there? If it is still there, we continue. Otherwise, we exit at that kill point and abandon the project. In the same way, if the customer has stopped paying money for the work that you're doing, you're not going to continue. And if the technological advanced has advanced even more, and the technology that you are implementing is obsolete, so you're not going to continue, rather you'll do something else. And if the legal requirement has changed again, you may not have to conduct the project further. So the idea is that you revisit the reason why you started the project again and again and again at every point where a particular phase of the life cycle comes to the conclusion. And if the reason doesn't exist anymore, you don't continue the project anymore. And the last idea here, we haven't talked about this in our class, so I'll just briefly give you this concept. There's this idea called OPM3. It is the Organizational Project Management Maturity Model, right? Organizational Project Management Maturity Model. Management Maturity Model. So there's three M's: M for management, M for maturity, M for model. So that is called a OPM3. It's a maturity model. Basically, this comes to us from this concept that was provided by Chris Argaris and then later on by Peter Senge. And the idea is that of a learning organization, an organization that learns from its mistakes, develops its own templates and tools and techniques, implements them, learns from their mistakes again, updates their templates and tools and techniques, improves upon them, and moves forward. Right. So the thought is that can we look at our projects and figure out whether we are a mature organization in the discipline of project management, or whether we are an immature organization in the sense of project management. Right. So certain organizations would be at level 1 of the OPM3 model, meaning that they're very immature. So what do we mean by an immature organization in terms of projects? Is an organization that doesn't have really any project management processes, and they're sort of doing their projects in an ad hoc manner. What would be the level 2 organization of OPM3? It would be a more mature organization where they are now no longer having ad hoc processes. Rather, they have some basic level of project management tools and techniques that they're using. What would be the level 3 then? It would be a more mature organization in the sense that they have used some of the basic tools and techniques. They have figured out what are some of the more advanced tools and techniques, and now they're using those. right? The more advanced tools and techniques. Level 4 organizations would be those that are now saying, okay, these advanced techniques are good enough, but I have improved upon this technique a little bit now. So here's my customized technique, or here's my own creation, right? And then finally, a level 5 organization on our OPM3 would be one that says, well, I have used the advanced techniques, I've created my own techniques, I've refined my own techniques, and now they're perfect, and I've taken tremendous benefit from them. So here you go, society. Here are my techniques, and now other organizations can feel free to use my techniques in order to move their projects from a low level management state to an improved level of management, right? So that's the concept behind OPM3, and I think that should be enough here. If you are interested in learning more about the OPM3, my suggestion would be that you visit the Software Engineering Institute's website at Carnegie Mellon Institute, right? So their website is sei.cmu.edu. It is an engineering group at Carnegie Mellon, which is concerned about software engineering, and they have something called the capability maturity model and the capability maturity model integration. And these two concepts, the CMM and CMMI, are basically what the OPM3 concept is modeled after. So if you want to read up about these in more detail, you just read up on the CMM and CMMI, and you will have a very good idea of what OPM3 is. But to conclude, then OPM3 has 5 layers or 5 levels for organization. Level 1, immature organizations that are using ad hoc project management. Level 2, organizations are those that are using basic level project management. Level 3 are those that are using advanced level project management. Level 4 are the ones that are now going into developing their own tools and techniques and improving upon them. And level 5 are the ones that have developed a whole battery of, or a whole collection of tools and techniques that have been tested and tried, and they're refined, and now they're helping other organizations to improve their project management. Right? So thank you very much. That concludes our third recap lecture, and I'll upload that to our website shortly. Thank you for listening. Take care.